So now we're ready to get started with the first actual full stack feature of our app, which is sending friend requests. So the way our application will work is that before you can start a conversation with anyone, you need to send them a friend request and they need to accept it. And to get started with that, we'll start with the backend side of things for requests. So the first thing you will need to do is to add a requests table in our database. So we'll open up the convex folder and go into schema.ts. And then we see we already have a users table. So after this comma, after that, we'll just create a new table called requests. And then we'll use the same define table function which we used before. And then our table will have two fields, which is firstly the sender, and the sender will be a v.id. So this is a special type which references an ID of another table. And in this case, we'll be referencing the ID of the users table. And then we'll have another field in this table called v.id, and that will be users as well. So we're basically creating a table where we'll store a mapping of the user ID who sent the request and the user ID who received the request. And again, to make searching along this table easier, we need to create indexes. So we'll say dot index, and the first one will be by underscore receiver. And then the field we'll pass in for that is the receiver field. So the index will be called by receiver and it's mapping to the receiver field which we have. And we'll also need to index by receiver underscore sender. And in this case, we need to pass in both the receiver and the sender to be able to get the data. So you'll see why we need this later, but we need both of these indexes to be able to search along this table. So now that we have the schema defined, we need to create the actual API endpoints, which the front end can call. So again, the naming convention is that you take the table name, and if you're doing a operation on a single request, we will call that in the request.ts file. And if we are doing an operation on multiple requests, such as getting all the requests for a certain user, we'll do that in requests.ts. So for now, we just want to be able to create a single request. So we'll go into the convex folder and create request.ts and save that. And then what we'll do is we'll say export const create, which will be the function the front end will call. And we'll create a mutation, which we will fetch from convex. The first field will be args, which is the arguments passed to it by the front end. And we will take in the email, and that will be of type v, which we import from convex dot string. And then the next field inside this dictionary is the handler. So that will be an async function, which will take in the context and the args that we have, and we'll create an arrow function. So what the front end will do is send us an email to which we want to send the friend request. And inside here, we'll create a request inside our table. And then the person who's receiving the request can fetch the request that they have and then render that on the front end. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get the identity of the current user who is sending the request, who's calling this create function. So we'd say const identity, and then we'll say await ctx dot auth dot get user identity. And since we had that integration between Clerk and Convex, this works out of the box. So we need to add a check if not identity, which means there is no current logged in user calling this. We'll just say throw new convex error, and we'll pass in the message unauthorized. But if this error doesn't happen, then we'll check if args.email is equal to identity.email. This basically means that the user tried to send themselves a request. So we'll create a new error, convex error, and we'll say can't send a request to yourself. Now this identity that we have is basically the object that's returned to us by Clerk. But if you remember, we did a mapping of Clerk users to our own users stored inside our Convex database. And whenever we're creating a request, we want to reference the Convex user instead of the Clerk user. So what we'll have to do is create a helper function. So we'll create another file called underscore utils.ts. And the underscore utils basically means that it won't contain any convex functions. So the front end can't really call these functions inside here directly. Over here, we'll create a function called export const get user by clerk ID export, and that will be an async function. It will take in the CTX and the clerk ID, and of course we need to add in the types for that. So we say colon, and then CTX will be either query CTX or mutation CTX, and we need to import these. So we'll go to the top and say import query CTX and also mutation CTX, and just remove this curly brace over here. And then of course this needs to be an arrow function, and then we'll define the type of clerk ID, which will just be a string. And then inside here, what we want to do is return await, take the ctx.db.query the users table, and then we use the with index function, and we use the by clerk ID index that we made. We take in the query and we say q.equal, and we want to match the clerk ID field to the clerk ID we are being passed in the function. And then since we want to get just one, we say .unique. And that's our helper function, and we'll be using this throughout our app. So we'll go back into request.ts and we'll say const current user is equal to await get user by clerk ID. We'll pass in the CTX and we'll pass in the clerk ID, which is equal to identity dot subject. Then we'll check if not current user. Then we'll throw a new convex error and we'll say user not found. Then we will get the receiver's identity. So we'll say const receiver is equal to await ctx.db.query. We'll query the users table again and we'll say dot with index by email, which we just defined. We'll get the query and we'll say q.equal, and the email field should be equal to args.email. And then we'll say .unique. So basically we're getting the email for which this function is being called, and then using that we're getting the user which should receive this request. And then again we'll add a check if not receiver, throw new convex user could not be found. Then we check const request already sent, because we don't want to be able to send multiple requests if they already exist. So await ctx.db.query requests, which we just made. And then we say with index and we use the by receiver underscore sender index, and we say q dot equal, the receiver should be equal to receiver dot id, and then we can change a dot equal because keep in mind our index is based on two fields and this should be underscore id. And then in the second equal it should be sender, and that should be equal to current user dot underscore id. And then we'll say if request already sent, throw new convex error request already sent. And then the last check which we want to do is const request already received is equal to await ctx.db.query. And what we can do is we can just copy the query which we did for request already sent, and all we want to do is replace current user and receiver. So we'll say current user for the first place and receiver for the second place, and save that. And if request already received, it should be D, then what we want to do is throw new convex error and say this user has already sent you a request. It should be D again. So after all of these checks have been complete, we finally know that we can send a request. So we'll say const request is equal to await ctx.db.insert. We'll insert into the requests table, and then the data we want to insert is the sender, which is current user dot id underscore id, and the receiver is receiver dot underscore id, and save that. And then lastly, we just return the request that we have made. So that's the backend, and now we'll get started with the front end.